going to share two very short readings with you this morning. The first is from Pat Robertson. The feminist agenda is not about equal rights for women. It's about a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their families, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Direct quote. The second is from Charisse Krameray, a former professor of women's studies and a communications theorist and author. Simply put, feminism is the radical notion that women are human beings. I'd like to take a moment and bask in the here and now, to delight in this balanced world we live in where men and women are always seen as equals. We're so lucky to be living in a post-sexist world, am I right? I know I'm right. I mean, laws, higher education, career opportunities, sports, family expectations, medical care, they're all so blind to gender. For gosh sakes, we have our first female presidential candidate. Clearly, our country has overcome all obstacles on the long and arduous road to equality. Oh, what's that you say? We're not living in a post-sexist world? You mean female victims of sexual assault are still blamed for their clothing choices? Female Olympic medalists are still referenced to by their husbands' credentials? Wait, we at least have mandatory paid maternity leave, right? No? No? Get out of here. Okay, I confess to using sarcasm. Yes, and this is one of them. I confess to using sarcasm. So, no, not about this being one of them. Thank you very much. So, if all of this and much, much more is still true of our society, then why is it that so many people, both men and women, young and old, feel we no longer need feminism? Why is there a movement of women against feminism that equates the very word feminism to another familiar F-bomb we all sometimes drop from time to time? Why would anyone who believes in equality of the genders not consider themselves a feminist in this day and age? We'll go back to that in a minute. You can be anything you want in this world, so long as you work hard for it. No excuses. If you weren't able to achieve it, it was because you didn't work hard enough for it. Can we try together? This is the mother's mantra many of us have either heard or repeated ourselves over the years. It was a solid message for me to hear as a girl child, but I confess it did make my first experience of blatant sexism a bit of a shock. I walked into the high school gym in a skirt and dress shoes on the first day of my 10th grade year. I know, a skirt. Shocking. I realized quickly that I was the only female who had signed up to be in that semester's team sports class. So I was instantly outnumbered 1 to 49. While this was unsettling, it wasn't exactly a surprise. I took my seat on the bleachers like everyone else and prepared to hear the usual first day of school introductions for the next hour. Instead, the coach opened up our time together by looking straight at me and asking, "What are you doing here?" Feeling slightly embarrassed and like perhaps I had missed some important small print on the class description, I said I was there to play team sports. "But you're a girl. We can't have girls in this class." I looked around at the 49 male faces watching and realized that no matter how personal and embarrassing this conversation felt, it was about more than just me. "Why not?" I asked shyly. "Because you'll get hurt, and then you'll whine and complain. You'll expect us to treat you with kid gloves. Plus, you don't want to risk your face getting messed up." Oh, no, he didn't. "I'm staying." And stay I did. I wish I could say it was an all-around success, but like most things in life, there were highs and there were lows. For instance, I'm fairly certain I did not make a basket the entire several weeks that we spent playing basketball. Not my proudest moment. And during an indoor game of touch football, I was tackled to the ground hard by a freshman with a rage problem. And yes, at one point I managed to hit a softball right into the pitcher's, well, you can imagine the sound of 48 boys falling to the ground in sympathy. I did, however, kick harder and further than anyone in the class during kickball, something even the coach had to begrudgingly recognize. I was a top recruit in soccer and wasn't too bad at lacrosse either. I made it out alive, having proven to myself and to each of those boys and the coach that girls could keep up just fine. My fight was very small. It was, in the grand scheme of gender equality, fairly inconsequential seeming. But looking back now, I know that every one of those faces that first day was waiting to see my reaction and the coach's reaction to know how they should respond. Should they laugh? Should they feel the sting of inequality beside me? Should they risk their status or invite questions about their masculinity by sticking their necks out for a girl? Would they have to confront the sexism that we all thought we'd moved past? Well, none of these questions answered themselves that year. By the time I graduated from high school 2 years later, there were almost 20 girls in that class. And somehow I felt a small difference had been made. Like race, income, age, sexual identity, and nationality, your gender plays a role in your privilege in our culture. But lest anyone of the non-female persuasion misunderstand, that's not a request or a demand that you feel guilty for your station in life, but rather an invitation to recognize it, to empathize with the other, and to understand what it means to be an ally to them. It also means that simply identifying as a man doesn't mean you cannot benefit from gender equality and the feminist movement as well. Now, religion is an area of society in which a great deal of sexism still plays out. Many traditions, especially Western ones, continue to claim a male-dominant doctrine, which allows only men, and particularly only male-born, not male-identified persons, to seek formal ministry credentials, to obtain power within the faith affiliation's hierarchy, and in many cases, in the believer's personal life and family structure. To this day, the Latter-day Saints continue to excommunicate women who express pro-feminist theology and seek ordainment of women within the Mormon Church. And to be an ordained woman in a Buddhist sect, it would depend on where exactly you're located geographically. In Reform, Renewal, Reconstructionist, and Humanistic Judaism, women and men are considered equals, and both have been able to be fully engaged in and ordained in the traditions more or less from their inception. Conservative Judaism took a bit longer to come around, and of course, Orthodox ordainment is still reserved only for men. Even our tradition has a history of intolerance of women in the pulpit, though we have done a fabulous job of making up for it. As Vanessa Cowie so brilliantly explained in her sermon on Olympia Brown last month, Unitarians and Universalists have long been at the head of the class when it comes to gender equality in religion and in society at large. Olympia Brown being the first female to graduate from a theological school and the first to be ordained in the United States. She was given the title of Reverend by the Universalist Council in 1863. And we have the proud ability to claim several leading U.S. suffragists as Unitarians and Universalists. But even with these jewels in our crown, we remained, shall I say, a boys' club until rather recently. In 1977, our General Assembly presented the Women and Religion Resolution, which demanded the UU Association examine the culture of our church in relation to our language and assumption around gender roles. The resolution passed unanimously. Now, for anyone who has been to the General Assembly business meeting, you can understand how impressive such a feat would be. At that point in history, though, only 5% of UU ministers identified as female. In 1994, 30% of our clergy identified as female, and today it's estimated that we represent the majority of ordained clergy within our movement. We are the highest amount of female clergy ordained in the United States of all faith associations. As women in the ministry and women in leadership roles within congregations has grown, so has the commitment to broader social justice concerns, including reproductive justice, paid parental leave, work against domestic violence, and poverty affecting women and children, amongst others. Our theology began to change too. We began using more inclusive language. A feminized image of God emerged in language, song, and in scriptural interpretation. And as many might remember, the 7 principles that hang on nearly every UU church's walls would never have been created without the persistence of women within our movement seeking to create a more female-friendly faith tradition. The original statement and purpose for the UUA made frequent reference to the dignity of man, to the brotherhood and fellowship. It referred to presidents and ministers, officers, and even the UUA moderator exclusively as he, him, and his. In 1985, we adopted the current 7 principles, and along with it, we affirmed women of their place within our faith movement. Similarly, the feminist movement in the United States has brought great change to our country. First wave feminism began in the 19th century and lasted into the 20th. Its origins can be found in the French Revolution of the 18th century, when the freedoms so hard won during the Liberal Revolution excluded women. The contradiction was too obvious to ignore, and women began speaking on it collectively. Much like the early feminists in France, first-wave feminism in the US focused primarily on legal issues like gaining the right to vote, rights to their own children, inheritance laws, and rights to pursue higher education at newly identified gender-mixed colleges, amongst other issues. Once these basic rights were secured, a new, more radical feminism emerged, second-wave feminism. Many of you were amongst these second-wave feminists who historians have decided began their term around early 1960s. New issues were tackled, like sexuality, family, reproductive rights, and workplace rights. Attention to domestic violence, sexual assault, and the right to divorce were brought to light. We saw the publication of The Second Sex and The Feminine Mystique, 2 classic books which engaged in critiquing society's rigid gender roles at the time. Like many political movements that have arisen over the decades, there were many who criticized the methods of second-wave feminists. They compared them to those engaged in first-wave work and decided that they were too radical, too demanding, too impatient. For those criticizing second-wavers, it was one thing to grant them certain legal equalities, but an entirely different thing to empower them, to hear their anger over continued patriarchal attitudes and practices, and to grant them bodily autonomy. The second wave interrupted in a firm, and one would think final way, the continued belief that one gender was superior over another, a frightful idea for those in the position of power. During this time period, some of the more serious limitations of feminism were also brought to light. One of the most serious charges against the movement is that it was created by and for white women, and whether intentionally or not, excludes those who are at the intersection of being female and of color, or those who identify as transgender. A more inclusive term came about in response to this charge, womanist. First coined by Alice Walker in 1983 as a way to include women of color. The feminist movement traditionally was a middle-class white women's movement and rarely included women of color. In its first wave in the 19th and 20th centuries, the movement fought for suffrage rights for white women, though many of them were abolitionists. Although feminism addresses and fights for gender equality, it rarely addressed equality and justice for black women. It was never involved in the civil rights movement to help guarantee black women's social equality. Unfortunately, there have also been some claims that some members of the feminist movement were racist. Justine Talley mentions in her article, Why Womanism? The Genesis of a New Word and What It Means, that many early so-called feminists supported racist eugenics initiatives, including sterilization of minority women. This is a serious accusation. The other frequent charge against the movement is that it's anti-men and anti-family. Take Pat Robertson's quote during our reading today. Firstly, can I say some of those things are not like the other? Being a lesbian clearly does not belong in the same sentence as kill their children and destroy the world, but I digress. Overall, this position is ridiculous. Sure, there are some women who identify as feminists who may take issue with men, just as there are some feminists who take issue with the color green, or whether or not they should drink hot or cold tea. But the feminist movement was not created, nor was it sustained, on hatred for the male species. As our second reading explained, the mission and focus has always been on equality of the genders. So where are we now? We have voting rights. We can work where we want, including positions of power previously reserved solely for men. We earn our own money. We have readily available birth control. We're able to be drafted into the military beside our male peers. And for most of us, we can dress as we please. So do we still need feminism? Now, I think the title of the service today gives away my answer, but just in case, yes, we still need feminism. We need feminism for the same reasons I listed at the beginning of the sermon, because patriarchy is inherent in our society. It's infused in our language, our most dominant theologies, our politics, our healthcare, because whether we have a law to support us or not, women are still being told that their lives are not their own, that their bodies are not their own, and their achievements are not their own, because women are still being killed for saying they're not interested in a man who hits on them, because our opinions and our presence are deemed unnecessary when making decisions about our healthcare options, because victim blaming is still a major hurdle for women who have experienced sexual assault, because the guaranteed freedom to choose is disappearing slowly but surely, because boys are still being told that having emotions, aside from rage, is a weakness, because they're being introduced to the toxic idea that there is one acceptable way to be a real man, just as little girls are becoming introduced to a plethora of ways to hate their bodies at an increasingly earlier age. Luckily, we are living through the somewhat controversial third wave feminism, a time marked by the recognition of the intersection of race and gender, a wave that is more inclusive of those who were not born female, but for whom sexism and patriarchy still oppress. Third wave feminism knows we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We needn't scratch the whole idea of feminism simply because we see the need for changes. We dishonor the women who risked their lives, their careers, their families, their freedom for us to be able to dismiss feminism as an outdated trope. We cannot stop now when there are still so many people in our own country content to push us back into the 1950s. When there are still women, and yes, men, who are still relying on it for their basic human rights. We are the torchbearers and the beacon of hope for oppressed women around the world. Feminism runs through our veins as UUs. Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, Margaret Fuller, a proud, strong lineage shored up in our blood. Own it. Use it. And for gosh sakes, please don't let the F-bomb drop. Amen. May it be so, and blessed be. A rather famous quote from an unknown author reads, "Here's to strong women. May we know them. May we be them. May we raise them. May it be so."